Thank you for joining us for the third webinar in the National Guild's four-part series on evaluation as a strategy for building creative youth development programs. These 4 webinars are being presented as a year-long series provided by the Creative Youth Development National Partnership. Our partners include the National Guild for Community Arts Education, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities, and Americans for the Arts. I'm Heather Eichmeyer, Chief Program Officer at the National Guild, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. I'm also joined by an incredible group of speakers who will introduce themselves to you in just a moment. And I want to give a big shout out to Sheena at the Guild for steering the ship today. She's behind the scenes, making sure everything runs smoothly. And also Ruth Mercado Zizzo at Edvestors, who's going to be my partner in crime in monitoring the chat box today and sharing some resources throughout. So Sheena and Ruth, thanks for joining us. In the first 2 webinars of the series, we explored the basic principles of creative youth development and their implications for evaluation, and then how to design and use surveys and observational protocols. On today's webinar, we will focus on thinking through comparisons and how correlational work can be a major step in thinking about the impacts of your CYD practice. For those of you who have been with us since the beginning of the series, welcome back. And if you are joining us for the first time, we are very excited to have you. While each of these webinars is designed to stand on its own, we are also scaffolding the series. So if you missed one of the previous webinars and are a Guild member, we encourage you to log into our website and watch the past recordings. Sheena, let's go to the next slide. So today's webinar is scheduled to last 90 minutes. Please know that the recording of this webinar, the slide presentation, and relevant resources will be shared with you afterwards. So don't feel like you have to write everything down. We encourage your active participation in many ways. We want you to ask questions. We want you to share your thoughts and insights. If you have resources that you'd like to put in the chat box, we'll capture those and send those afterwards to the group. And there'll be some prompts along the way to encourage your reflection on several ideas and themes. Due to the large number of participants, your lines have been muted. So if you'd like to ask a question or share an idea, we want you to do so. And the way to do that is to simply type it in the chat box on the right side of your screen. We will be monitoring these questions, as I noted, and we will be pausing throughout the webinar to get to as many of them as we can. We know it can be very tempting to multitask. I've said this on the last 2 webinars as well. And we just really encourage you to give yourself the gift of being focused and engaged for the next hour and a half so that you can take in these ideas, the reflections, and the thoughts of the group, and also just follow along in the chat as well. So thank you so much for being here today. And now it is my great, great pleasure to turn things over to the chair of our series, Denny Palmer-Wolf, who will introduce herself and our speakers. Denny, take us away.
Hi, thank you all for either joining us for the first time or coming back to join the conversation. So today we have, exactly as Heather said, a remarkable cast of characters. We have Gladys Hidalgo from Raw Artworks, who's here both as representing the voice of youth and also here to represent the perspective of youth leaders coming up in the field. We have 3 people from the New Victory Theater, Lindsay Buller-Malakiel and Courtney J. Boddy and Ben Weber. And we are very lucky to have Nicole Amry here, also from CECI in San Antonio, plus Heather and Sheena helping us. So that's who we are today, and of course, you, the audience. So next slide, Sheena, please. So today we're going to be working through the next big idea in this series. We're really going to be thinking about why evaluation gains power and usefulness by conducting comparisons. We're going to look at two cases. The first case study is a collective impact study in which organizations join together to use a common set of measures to look at youth outcomes and look at the correlation between participating in youth programs and outcomes. And Nicole from CYD will really lead us in talking about how her organization has taken up that. And then we'll have a second case study where we look at what happens, both what are the demands and what are the benefits, if your organization moves to what is often called a quasi-experimental design, where you're comparing the youth who are your treatment group with another or a control group of students who are quite like them in every way. Then we want to save time at the end for an extended Q&A. If you remember, those of you who are with us at the end of the second session, we offered you an interim assignment to think about your own practice and use that to generate questions for us. So next one, please, Sheena. So this gives you an overview of where we'll be today. Next, so you can see how we've built from the very basic and important values of participatory evaluation with youth voice, all the way up through a set of tools we've looked at earlier. If you weren't with us for those sessions, exactly as Heather said, we recommend that you think about them. And then today, the two kinds of comparisons. Next session, next slide, please, Sheena. So just a quick word about why comparisons are so important. Comparing things is really one of the most fundamental ways in which we as human beings make sense of our judgments. So there are lots of different kinds of comparisons. So for instance, when we say there's growing inequality in the US, what we're doing is comparing how income was distributed in 1950, in 1970, in 1990, and now. And it's really that comparison that gives that statement its force and its punch. Or when we say low-income students have fewer arts education opportunities, we're comparing one group of students to another group of students. And through that comparison, we're really making clear what the inequalities are for two groups of young people. Or I could say, she's a terrific drummer. And even though there's not an explicit comparison there, what I'm saying is, if I use my yardstick of excellence in jazz drumming, this young woman is way at the top of that scale. Much of the descriptive data that we looked at earlier, so for instance, when we looked at programs from the Moth Radio Hour, we were looking at statements about how impactful a program is, but we weren't really looking or using the power of comparisons to inform that looking. And today we're going to look at two cases where we step up to that idea of using comparisons to help us understand. Next slide, Sheena, please. So in discussing the two cases, we just wanted to share a kind of framework for you who are listening. Some of you may be quite ready to take on this kind of work, but for others of you who may be listening, these approaches may be much more than you've ever taken on in the past. It's entirely possible that when you hear what Nicole has to say or what Victory has to say, that you'll feel like overwhelmed like a huge tsunami of terms and data points and ways of operating are coming at you. But we thought it was really important for everyone to have access to this kind of information about evaluation and to think about what you now do, however modest or however you are at the beginning, as really laying the foundation for evaluations that you might want to try doing later on. And so to think about your daily practice in light of, is it the foundation for the kinds of comparisons that we might want to make in the future? When you listen to these speakers, it's also important to recognize that neither CYD nor NUVIC ever did these kinds of evaluations before. So each of them is going to speak really candidly to what the demands, to what the lessons, to what the stumbles were, and to what they learned in the process of doing it. So exactly as you would say to a student who says to you, oh, I can't possibly speak in front of a group of adults, or, oh, college isn't for me, or, oh, I can't be a part of a mural team, I can't draw. You say to those students, no, you can. You can build your skills, you can move towards this. This is in your future, or it could be in your future, so try. So it's really in that spirit that we're sharing both what CYD and NUVIC have to offer. Next slide. Hi, Sheena, next slide. Yeah, so here we are at the very first case for today, CYD, and Nicole will talk to us about the power of comparing their program students with the wider population of students, which puts CYD in the position of saying, how do our students do as compared to others in our district or our city or our county? So please, next slide, and Nicole, take it away.
Thank you, Denny. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Emery. I'm the program director for CYD, or San Antonio UCS, in San Antonio, Texas. We are a creative youth development program that is year-round, long-term, and tuition-free. It's very important to us to explain that distinction. Our students are with us from the 6th through 12th grade. They do come in at different grade levels, but potentially a 6th grader could join us and not leave until they're graduating high school, getting ready for college. So we have the benefit of watching them grow up and being able to capture some data. We operate in this building, this lovely building here in the slide, with about 200 students that fluctuates throughout the year on site, and then of course community-based programs where we go out into the community and take what we do with more short-term projects. So the idea of our program is our students are choosing a discipline if they're in high school, or getting a foundation if they're in middle school, and working and learning through projects that we share with the community. So we are a public gallery and theater space. We're multidisciplinary in that we have 4 different distinct studios that our students can work in: a visual arts studio, a film and photography studio, a theater studio, and a new media studio, which is a program that started as game design and now includes animation, creative coding, interactive fiction, interactive arts, etc. So you can, next slide, please. So the reason I think that I love the way Denny set it up. It's exactly overwhelming was the word. As the program director, I'm the one that's pretty much in charge of efficacy and understanding whether our programs are succeeding, how our students are doing, and how we relate to the community. Just a little background, I'm an alum of the program. I was in CYD through high school. I'm a visual artist, and I went to school and studied because of CYD's impact on my life and in the community. I studied nonprofit management, PR, and as well as my painting degree. So I'm an artist trying to do data work, which is, you know, laughable. But for me anyway, but the reality is I've had a lot of help, and we look to raw arts by to understand ways to build measurement. All of our measurement tools and the way we evaluate internally have come from talking to other CYDs around the country, and a lot thanks to the Guild being able to connect with people to build things that really tell our story and allow our students to tell our story. But here in town, we are part of a collective impact association or network of out-of-school time programs. CEOs in out-of-school time youth serving programs have gotten together many years ago and decided we're doing fantastic work. We need to be more connected, and we want to serve more of San Antonio's youth. And as it's grown, as the CEO meetings have grown, we've really developed a network of out-of-school time programs who are starting to share language and starting to understand which youth we share and how those youth are doing and how we can reach more. And so through that work, we've come to, and that work is Excel Beyond the Belt. That's the name of our organization. So if you hear that, that's just the term for all of the youth serving organizations that are in this network. There are about 335,000 young people between the ages of 5 and 17, so what we call school age in Bexar County. Yet, based on a couple of years ago with a university who's done a study on our county and our city at large, only 19% of them have access to what we have deemed quality out-of-school time programming. So part of our strategy to serve more of those young people is to understand our impact, and so we have distinct goals that we share as a collective impact initiative should. And part of that is data collection. No one program necessarily has somebody in charge of data for their students or in collecting in the community. So what we wanted to do is use the power of our group to reach out and understand the makeup of our city and the districts. And this is an initiative we called Ed Success. So the educational success of our students. Even though our programs, what they're doing with us might be visual arts or, you know, the orchestra or after school tutoring or karate, we wanted to understand, are these, the time they're spending with us, how are they impacting them in school? Because for us, that is a language that parents will want to speak, and funders will want to speak, and district leaders want to speak. So the idea here is that we have a fantastic partner called P16 Plus, which is a member of a larger, the National Strive Together Cradle to Career Network, which is our data-driven organizations. And so by partnering with this group and sharing our mission, we've gained access to data that no one of us could have managed. So you can forward this slide. So what this means for SACY is this is the first time we've had access to data that we didn't necessarily prioritize as much as our program effectiveness, so these internal measures. This is the first time we're thinking about our students' standardized test scores or their attendance at school, or if they've been written up as far as their behavioral issues. And so this is the first time that we're actually looking at that. And what we had to do was get our student ID numbers from our students, which is their identification number within their districts. And for the 4 districts, again, this is a pilot, we've been growing. Of the 4 districts, we were able to get about 84 of our 146 students. We identified them as students who we can gain data on. And so that's a little over half of the students that come to SACY. So if I haven't mentioned already, the difficult part of San Antonio is that we are not a unified school district. Within our city and the greater area, there are about 17 independent, distinct school districts. So you can imagine the headache of trying to communicate with all of those different districts as smaller nonprofits. But because we are a collective impact movement and we've partnered with this fantastic organization, they are able to get those data agreements and connect us with data on our students. So what we're looking at today is we've given a report, a roster of our students to P16, and they have gathered the data and given us a report back. And so I'm happy to share what we've learned this last year. We've only had this report for the last 2 years, and as a pilot, we're learning a lot. And the report from last year to this current year has grown phenomenally, and I'm starting to understand and be able to talk to our staff and our students about what we're seeing. And so, if you want to move this slide forward. So, oh, that did not translate well. Well, you can see the map. What we're looking at is a total number of the students who have been reported and the students who are in the district. So what these dots are showing us is from our organizations. These are where our students are coming from. These are the campuses. We have personally in CYD, we're seeing students from over 35 campuses across those 4 districts. Next slide. We were able to look at our demographics and understand how we're comparing to the rest of the groups. So I'll just kind of explain, because all of the slides are sort of set up this way. On the far left, you'll see a green and it says agency. Those are our CYD students. To the right, you have Excel Beyond the Bell, San Antonio. So these are all of the students within our network. So this collective impact of the organizations sent in their rosters. And so this is the group that we know belongs to a quality out of school time program. To the right, these are the those district averages. And at the far column, Bexar County, this is the larger group of San Antonio and the areas surrounding our city. Next slide. So they break it down for us. Like I mentioned, we are 6th through 12th grade. So our results are only showing our students. These are 6th through 12th graders. So if there were measurements in elementary school, we did not gain any of that data, because we're not serving any elementary school on site currently. So next slide. This is the time that we spent learning. So something we haven't really ever looked at is our students' attendance at school. So this is the first time we've spoken this language. We've actually been able to see how our students are doing at school, looking at the idea of chronic absenteeism, understanding what a school or a district's standard for chronic absenteeism is, and then seeing how our students compare. So while as a network, our students are doing really well, very low amount of absenteeism. The district's at 11, we're at 6, kind of in between. So this is a learning situation for us. Next slide. Again, in disciplinary incidents, the standard is only being written up or getting in trouble once in the school year. So our students have less disciplinary incidents than their districts and the larger network. Next slide. So those are interesting, but of course, what we're really curious about is how they're doing academically. And so these are the first slides that have to do with standardized tests. And so I know that there are all kinds of standardized tests throughout different states. Ours is called the STAR. And they're given at certain grade levels to indicate college readiness. And so what we're looking at is our younger students, so middle schoolers who are showing that they're college ready based on where they're expected to be learning and reading. We were excited to see that our students are doing overwhelmingly better, I guess, than their districts and the county and even the network, which is very curious to us. Next slide. So this is retention. So this is actually students passing to the next grade level, and what is in this nifty hieroglyph in English is actually 100% versus 99% for the network and 97% for the districts. So our students, every one of safety students are passing the next grade level, and of course they have to be in our program. Education comes first. It's part of their contract. They turn in their grades to prove that they're passing. So we weren't surprised there. Next slide. Again, looking at reading scores for our middle schoolers, more specific, we were able to see, I'm sorry, not just our middle schoolers. This is actually looking at any of our students who did at some point do their eighth grade reading test. So this reflects our 11th graders, our 12th graders, as well as our high school students as well. What we're seeing here is that we have in the limited category, where a student comes, tests show that they have limited reading capacity, our numbers are much lower than the network and the districts. Our expected, where our students are meeting the standard and where they are expected to be reading, is much greater, and so is our accelerated readers. Next slide. This was an interesting find for us. Last year, we noticed that while it was consistent, our reading levels were much higher last year and this past year. Math was something we hadn't really thought about, and I don't know if it's the true for everywhere, but in growing up here in San Antonio, a lot of creatives, a lot of artists, and a lot of young artists will tell you, I'm not good at math. I'm just not, that's not my thing. I'm an artist. That's the excuse. This is kind of I don't know if it's a cultural thing, but we were interested to see how our students were doing in math. And this is the first time the previous scorecard we received, a report we received, we talked to the staff about their ideas about math. And we just had some informal conversations about math being part of the projects in the studios and part of the experience of learning to be an entrepreneur as an artist. So this year it was really exciting to share that our students are all passing their math exams, standardized exams. And again, our reflection is higher than the other organizations and the district and county. Next.
Nicole, while we're searching for that slide, I had a quick question for you. A couple of folks have asked. So in this example, you're correlating your outcomes to some academic outcomes, and the question was, is part of SACY's mission and programmatic goals, did it start out, were you already looking at those academic outcomes, or were you trying to correlate your outcomes to those academic indicators, if that makes sense? Were you already sort of striving to make an academic impact with your program?
So yes and no. The reality of our program is that it is an extensive program. Our high schoolers have to make 8 to 10 hours a week, 8 during the school year, and then that number goes up to 10. It's a big commitment. It is year-round, long-term, but the idea is that we're preparing them for higher ed, and we're preparing them for a career where they get to use their creativity to make a living. And so while we orient our new students and parents with the culture that this is a college-going culture, you're expected to find your way to a place where you want to study higher education and keep your grades up while you're in SACY. Education comes first. We prioritize them bringing in their report cards, talking to them about their grades if they're struggling, connecting them with tutors. But we've never really at this level looked at how are they faring in standardized tests in something that's more statewide. We've never had access, nor have we prioritized going that deep. It was really just the extent of how are you passing this grading period? So this is the first time we've talked about it. In the informal conversation where we were discussing math, that did come up. So are we interested in pushing these ideas if it's helping our students graduate? And while there was no answer, it was just kind of we're doing what we should be doing. We have to decide or think about how much more we really want to do, because if they're struggling, the reality is they couldn't really handle the load that SACY adds to their life. So it's many times an incentive to keep their grades up. Our students do take the leave of absence if they need to focus on their grades. Midterms come up your junior year. That's a really hard time. If you need 2 weeks, we totally understand. So it's a partnership, but no specific programming based on rising these levels of test scores or things like that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. That's great, and I know we're going to move to Gladys and Denny in just a second here. Just one sort of additional question that came in while you were going through those graphs was, also how you controlled for differences in socioeconomic background. So when you were comparing your data to the aggregated public data, you know, how do you control for differences in terms of background?
Sure. So the reality is, we as a network, it was much more aggregated as a network to see the impact of being in an out-of-school term program. So the reality is, we understand, we know which of our students came from which socioeconomic households and backgrounds, but we understand the network's makeup, and we can see the demographic for the network, but not organization to organization. We can't compare ourselves to another partner or anything like that. As for the district, we do have the district makeup, and knowing our demographics based to the district, we really do reflect. These are the largest districts in San Antonio, and with the highest number of lower income families. So that's the extent to which we understand that difference.
Great, thanks.
So
Yeah.
Heather, yeah, this is Denny. Just a comment on this, watching the questions in the box. One of the great powers of a collective impact study like the one Nicole has described is you get access to large bodies of public data that are collected already, that you don't have to collect. So in the case of San Antonio, grades, discipline, demographics, those kinds of things. One of the harder things is that you get just what's collected publicly in the way that it's collected publicly. So as Nicole was saying, they can't, for instance, compare themselves to another organization who serves exactly the same demographics that they serve. And we'll come back to this in a minute, but it's, you know, the great power of a collective impact study, but it is also that you are a member in a body of data that are the things that agencies and districts and cities standardly collect. And you have less power to manipulate the data, say, than you do for data you've collected yourself. So maybe, Gladys, do you want to take us to your questions, either these or other ones that have occurred to you?
Yeah, so my first question was how young people were involved in this process of reflecting the data and then reapplying it to the programming, either through alumni or possible interactions with staff.
Is that a question for me?
Oh, yeah.
Clear.
Yes, Gladys.
Okay,
yes.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry about that. So at this point, this is only our second report, and for the first time, I've actually been able to share some of this with our seniors. So in addition to the other things I do, I'm sort of in charge of preparing the seniors for graduation and fulfilling all the requirements. And so we had a writing workshop based on college essays. And this is the first time I was able to share with them, did you know? And they were pretty astounded, but also really excited to kind of explain to me why they think they did so well in reading and writing. And so this was a chance for them to articulate, I see how SACY and being in SACY has helped me outside and in my school endeavors. Was that the whole question?
Yeah, it did. So my next question was how you used your data to inform your programs, but you did mention that you guys applied a little bit more of a mathematical angle to your business development program, right?
So very informally, the reality is we're project-based learning, so our students propose an answer, a work of art to parameters we set or an event coming up. With those sets of parameters. In that process, just by having a conversation about math with our teaching artists, they in turn came up with the idea of, for example, this is one example, of involving the students in understanding budgets. So in understanding how an artist has to set a budget for a project or a proposal, or write a grant that involves a budget, and each studio has their own budget for each project. So at this point, the students in different studios in different ways are starting to have conversations like, oh, okay, so our whole studio only has this amount for this show, and I'm proposing to use X amount of dollars to buy rebar. How fair is that? How much rebar should I get? Should I make my project smaller or use more students in this project? Things like that.
Yeah, so just before this is Denny, Nicole, just as we make the transition from this excellent presentation about CC, are there lessons or advice that you would give to other programs who may be listening in about becoming a part of a collective impact study?
Sure. Lessons is always start small, involve partners, get them to buy in, but just ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask the questions, because the reality is there is not somebody else. I do not have an amazing university intern who's like data hungry and super excited to do this for me. Ask the questions because other nonprofits are thinking it, other youth organizations are thinking it, and also being a creative youth development program within a collective impact movement that is just youth development in general, we're sort of the sore thumb sometimes in saying, well, we don't really do these shared standards. We don't work to, this neat package of curriculum. We're kind of messy, and we've never done this before, and it's really helped our P16, who's collecting the data, understand, okay, you're not using it the way the Boys and Girls Club is. You're not using it the way Big Brothers Big Sisters is, so just speak out and ask the questions. No questions silly. And then when it comes to this teaching artists, involve them in understanding what the community looks like, what their students are going through. Just being reminded that, oh, they do have to do standardized tests, and it's stale and ugly, but our work does affect it. So if that was a lesson, what you mentioned about not being able to control, that's really interesting, but that's why we have internal measures. This is really exciting to just be part of a larger impact, to understand what our city looks like and how our students fare, and just kind of be curious about, why are they doing so well in reading? Is it because we just attract all the strong readers and writers, or is it because this program is really feeding that part of their skill sets? It goes both ways, and it's learning for us. So that's it.
Terrific. Okay. Heather, you want to take us to the 1 minute?
Sure. Sheena, can we go to the next slide? Great. So if you've been with us through this series, you know what we're about to do. And if you're joining us for the first time, here we go. We would like you all to just take a moment. We're going to reflect on this question. So we would like you to just think about how your own organization might combine what you currently do for evaluation with a collective impact approach similar to what Nicole just shared with us. What would you want to get from each? We're not going to share these out right now, but just want you to take a moment to scribble down on a piece of paper, or turn to a colleague, or just close your eyes and just think about this question. And if you're brave enough to share some of your thoughts, we always welcome them in the chat box for others to be inspired by. And as you're wrapping up those thoughts, I just want to also point you back to the chat box. As we've been talking, Ruth has shared some really good questions for thought, which we'll share out with you all after the presentation as well, around some additional points of reflection around how you might approach working in this way within your own local communities. Sheena, let's go to the next slide. So I think in the interest of time, Denny, since we got to several questions along the way, and some of them actually speak to, I think, what's coming up, let's move on, and I'll ask questions along the way.
Okay. All right. So Nicole has given us a terrific picture of how a collective impact study can give you one powerful set of comparisons. So she's now able to see how CYD's students do relative to other students in San Antonio or other students throughout the county. At the same time, you know, she might be at a city council meeting and a particularly sharp-eyed city councilor might say, well, wait a minute. I saw that your 8th grade students already surpass other students in the area in their reading levels. Isn't it possible that CYD is just attracting higher performing students? Or maybe your students are more motivated, or maybe they come from better schools or safer neighborhoods. In other words, that city councilor might be saying, it's great that there's this correlation between better behavior and better academic outcomes for, say, C students, but I want to know more about what it is that the program does that could be causing that. So let's try and think in this next case about what we could do in an evaluation to answer these kinds of questions. One of the questions that came up in the box put it somewhat differently. That person said, how do we know that we're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges? So next slide, Sheena, please. So in this next case, which is the New Victory Theater, we're going to look at an organization that decided that they wanted to attempt really an apples to apples comparison. What the federal government and scientific organizations often call a quasi-experimental evaluation. Can we get the next one, Sheena, please? So I'm going to make the transition here to the New Vic team.
Great. So there are 3 of us on the call from the New Victory Theater. Let's introduce ourselves first so you know who you're listening to. So I am Lindsay Buller-Maliekel, and I'm the Director of Education focused on public engagement, which basically means our families and our young people in out-of-school time hours.
I'm Courtney Body, Courtney J. Body, actually, and I'm Director of Education, and I focus on school engagement here at the New Victory.
And I'm Ben Weber. I'm currently a teaching artist with the New Victory Theater, and I formerly was the program manager for our research program that you'll hear more about called Spark.
Great. So as an overview about what the New Victory Theater is we're right in New York City, right on 42nd Street. And we basically present work from all around the world and across a ton of performing arts genres. So over the course of a season, this season, for instance, we've got 15 shows. We've got a dance show called The Migration, a magic show, a narrative piece that's from the UK, and for all different age groups. The focus of the New Victory Theater really is on bringing absolutely incredibly high quality work that is complex and challenging and sophisticated to New York City audiences of school kids and families. Next slide.
Great. So I'm going to give you an overview of the Spark program. As Lindsay said, we work with a wide range of students and kids across the city, pre-K through 12th grade. And the Spark program is a subset of our larger partnership program where we actually partner with over 170 schools during the school year. The Spark program actually stands for Schools with Performing Arts Reach Kids. We received a 5-year grant from the Tana and Pierre Matisse Foundation to start a new program that had impact through the arts. We already were working with a great deal of schools by bringing them to come see our live performances. But how could we reach schools that didn't necessarily know who we are or that we even exist, and schools that weren't having the kinds of resources or were under-resourced to be able to provide arts programming for their students, but understood the value? And so that was our approach. In initially sort of designing this program, the main goal was to be able to help schools that were under-resourced in low-income neighborhoods to be able to build sustainable arts programming in their schools. But we also were thinking about our ticket inventory. So what did we have the most amount of ability to bring kids from the outer boroughs in to see? And in thinking about that wide range, we were thinking that elementary and middle school was the right sort of zone where we had enough to be able to provide our schools that we were already working with, but also bring in these new schools, and thinking about the scope of this program as well. So the idea of being able to reach that goal is that students would see live performances, 3 in a given year, that the students will see a narrative production, they will see a dance or a physical movement production, and a circus production. And that way, over the course of a multi-year residency with us, that they would be able to see up to at least 9 performances while working with the New Victory, and then beyond. In addition to that, each year they would work with teaching artists in 15 residency sessions, and that the teachers and the school administration would have teaching artists specifically to work with them in a professional development manner to build their own skills, not only as classroom teachers to be able to bring and incorporate the arts into their classrooms, but in addition to thinking about the school, so working with the principal, the assistant principals, et cetera, to be able to help them think about how do we make sure that field trips are happening, that we're partnering with cultural organizations, and that we're able to have arts programming inside of our schools as part of the fabric of that school community.
So the exciting part of this is that we decided to launch this huge program, and simultaneously we decided for the first time ever to do research, studying the impact of what this program meant for these young people and then these schools, and we decided to do it big. And this is all possible because we got a grant. So we can talk more as we continue on about what this means, but it is a significant amount of resources, none of which we had ever had before, that we decided to focus in on this. And this is also why we jumped into the ability to do comparisons of what we call treatment kids and control group kids. Next slide. So our treatment kids are the kids who are actually getting the program. So they are the kids in these schools that are coming to see live performances, 3 a year, 9 over the course of their time with us. They're working with teaching artists. Their teachers are partaking in professional development. Those are the treatment kids. And then we needed to figure out, okay, if we wanted to do the kind of research that would have a control, how would we pick kids that don't get our program? And 6 years ago, Courtney and I, and along with a couple of other people, sat in a room, and it was a heart-rending conversation as we tried to figure out what in the world would we do that would basically say we were going to be interacting with these kids, but providing absolutely no programmatic support to them.
Right, and so one of the things as a part of the program design is that we would start in an elementary school by working with the 3rd grade, and in an elementary school by working with the 6th grade, and then each year continue to follow those kids as they promoted up and continue to work with the incoming 3rd grade or 6th grade. So by the end of their three years together, we would be working with third, fourth, and fifth grade students in elementary schools, and sixth, seventh, and eighth grade students. So in building the program, we actually had an opportunity that, while programmatically for some of our program hearts was challenging to get to that apples to apples, we came to a conclusion.
Yeah. So originally we thought, well, maybe we'll find some schools that are matched on all sorts of demographics, and they'll be our research kids, and then the schools that we are working with on the program, they'll be our treatment kids. But that introduced a whole bunch of, as Denny puts it, sort of research noise into the equation. It was like, well, what if these schools what if the demographics matched, but they had a different principal, and therefore the principal and their teachers were giving them a different interaction during their 3 years, and that was what was accounting for any differences we saw. Or what if, yeah, the demographics matched, but the neighborhoods were so different that that was going to be the thing that was the difference between the research data that we saw. So what we chose to do was actually take the grade above the grade that we started with. So for our elementary schools, we were starting with third graders. That meant that we were starting with fourth graders as our control group, meaning we implemented the program in third grade. We started the research in third and fourth grade. The fourth grade was our control group. That way, even though we knew that, yeah, we might get a principal change in the middle of the research, or, you know, it might not be exactly the same experience because they were experiencing all these things a year different, that for the most part, they were kids from the exact same neighborhood. They were kids with the exact same demographics. They would mostly have the same teachers, and they would exist in the same school culture. So we decided that that was the best way to get a control group of students without introducing too much sort of variability into the data. Let's see, next slide, please.
So here at the New Victory Theater, we believe in the transformational power of the live performing arts, which is why our Spark program, at the heart of it, is students seeing so many live performances. An example, I love this quote, actually, and I was thinking about the safe enough space, that a theater coming to Times Square can be quite scary, especially for people whose kids are not necessarily allowed to travel on their own, or parents who don't normally go outside of their neighborhood. For them to sign a permission slip was a big deal for these kids, to be able to come on the subway or by bus far, far away, to come to Times Square, and then coming into our doors. One of the things that we really try to help both the teachers and the students, or whoever comes through our doors, is to feel like the New Vic is their home. And being inside the house, being able to sit in a seat that's comfortable, being treated with a lot of respect, and then seeing something amazing on stage. So an example of a piece of theater that the middle school students have seen in the last couple of years is Fly. And this production was about Tuskegee Airmen, and the audience got to see 4 Black men, seeing them go through this process of not only going through training, but also fighting in a war, in a time when they were fighting for a country that didn't necessarily respect them. And the idea of in the audience, there was a lot of audible responses. And then after every performance, we have talkbacks, and the conversation or the questions that were being asked of these actors were questions like, what did it feel like to, or how did you prepare to be a racist sergeant who is drilling these young men and calling them an N-word, or what did it feel like to be treated as such? These are the kinds of questions that young people can be grappling with in their own lives, and being able to see that not only played out in a dramatic fashion and understanding that it's history, but that there's a way to make a connection. And that's something that we are trying to figure out, what is the direct impact or the immediate impact and the lasting impact of having gone to see that experience and talk to those artists.
So we're very comfortable with creating that amazing, or not, we don't create it, but presenting this amazing art on the stage. But we really were trying to figure out, okay, well then how do you get to the science part? How do you get to the research? So if you want to go to the next slide, Sheena. So here is our logic model. And you might remember that Denny said early on that, we had never done research of this scale, or really of any scale, prior to embarking on this huge project. And Nicole mentioned at the very beginning that one of her tips was start small. The New Victory Theater absolutely ignored that tip, and we went big right away. So this was our logic model, and we were specifically, we spent a lot of time early on trying to make sure that this logic model felt like us. It felt like it was respecting the art that was on stage, the programs that we were doing. But to be completely honest and transparent, that at this point, we're 5 years into this now, I haven't looked at this logic model in probably 2 years. I'm not sure Denny is thrilled that I said that, but it was something that was really important at the very beginning. And then as we move forward into sort of the meat of it, it became a foundational piece as opposed to something that we were really looking on. Next slide.
This is Ben Weber here. What was really exciting about this opportunity to do the research was to really ask questions that were so personal and close to us as an organization. We got to dig deeply and measure the very things that we as teaching artists are going into classrooms to inspire. Are students becoming better and more comfortable performers? Is the sense of ensemble or community getting more strengthened? And are students becoming more fluent with their emotional expression? And so you can see our research questions very much reflect our intentions as teaching artists, as theater educators, and this is where we wanted to put our focus and measure the outcomes.
Next slide. So you'll notice none of those, we didn't decide to attach to test taking at all, partly because we realized it wasn't what we wanted to know the most about. So we are taking in research data in sort of 3 big ways. We are doing post-show surveys with every single student that is taking part in the Spark program across all 9 or 10 schools. So last year we did 2,300 post-show surveys. That's a lot. And then a smaller group, just 2 of our schools, 1 elementary and 1 middle school, are doing our socio-emotional measurement booklets. Last year we did 620 of those. And those measurement booklets are really, you can see on the slide, they're really looking at empathy, at emotional regulation, emotional identification. And these are tools that already existed in the realm of research that we were using to try to understand the impact of our Spark program specifically. And then an even smaller subset, so of those 2 schools that we're working with the socio-emotional measurement booklets, about 25 kids in each grade are doing these qualitative measurements, performance tasks and perspective taking tasks, which you'll hear a little bit more in the future. Next slide. So one of the things we wanted to share is that, holy cow, this took a ton of time. It took a ton of our senior staff time and our executive level time 6 years ago to decide what it was we actually wanted to study, to come to the decision that we weren't going to study test scores, that we weren't going to look at whether we changed their social studies test scores or anything like that. It was a huge decision, and that needed to be part of a conversation that came all the way from the top of our organization. So our executive vice president was in all of those conversations. And then we started working with outside consultants, and now Wolf Brown and Denny, I think of Denny as one of my most treasured coworkers. But it is important to note that at the scale of this study, there is no way in the world that we would have been able to do this on our own. I wouldn't have known where to begin. So those 2 things were really clear right from the outset.
A very unique and powerful element of our research process was actually recruiting our teaching artists, who are usually tasked with going out into schools and preparing young people to see a performance or debriefing their performance experience afterwards, transforming this group of people into artist researchers. And as teaching artists, we are usually committed to making a lot of modifications, having certainly going in with a plan, but definitely reading the temperature of the room and making adjustments to what is needed. But in terms of this more scientific process, we all needed to get on the same page and find a level of standardization that was unique and challenging for us as teaching artists. We often speak about plaid pants, sort of representing the playful clown teaching artist ensemble that we have, and transforming them, or rather asking them to put on white coats, representing the scientific researcher mode that they were required to be in. When I was the program manager for this research project, I had to learn a lot of things about interfacing with the Department of Ed in New York City, what a memorandum of understanding even was, and therefore how to draft it and who needed to receive it, and also submitting our intentions and our research plan to the Department of Education's Internal Review Board, or the IRB, and that was a lot of learning and hard work. And finally, we used many young people who we have on staff, our Usher Corps, to essentially take in and process the heaps of physical data that we would collect from our various data streams.
We actually have data parties after we collect a whole bunch of data, and we have a whole bunch of young people come in and stacks of paper. It's a little bit overwhelming. Next slide. Oh, look, there they are.
So you can imagine taking this motley crew of people and transforming them into researchers takes a bit of work and care, and deciding upon shared language would be very important.
Next slide. All right, so this is the data that came out after 1 year with our elementary school. And here are the two pieces of data that are statistically significant. So one of the cool things is basically, because we were working with such large numbers, we were able to get all the way to some of these things being statistically significant. And that's that little P, if you look at those numbers down below. Since that P is less than 0.05, our statistician tells us that means that we can actually now talk about that data as there is less than a 1 in 20 chance that is a fluke. We can talk about that data sort of as saying, like, we know that we are responsible, the Spark program is responsible for this change. And so the change in empathy, I try to make others feel better. And the peer relationships, which is basically a research task that asks them who will they collaborate with. Both of those were showing very, very clear and present trends that we know are due specifically to the Spark program. Next slide. And then we have some trend data that we're looking at as well. So if you look down at that little P number on the bottom, it says Spark effect, there's a B and then the P. You'll notice that those are both just above the 0.05, which means that we are close to this being statistically significant, but not quite. We're hoping that over the course of the next 2 years of data collection, that this becomes statistically significant as we get more and more data in. But we are able to say, oh, look, the very clear trend in this data is that we're also seeing some changes in how the young people sort of see themselves graduating from high school in the future, or who they see themselves being in the future, and how they feel about their school or their classroom. And that we think that if this continues to bear out, we will also be able to say this is due to the Spark program specifically. Next slide. And then we've got some that are a little bit further away, but again, we're starting to see some trends that we're really excited about. One of the ones that we're most excited about is that second one. I can imagine what life is like for people from other cultures. I am still learning all of the sort of research speak, but if you look at that D being 0.5, and the other one, the 0.57 is that D, that basically is starting to tell us that this isn't statistically significant yet, but if it becomes statistically significant, we can talk about the fact that it's a big jump. It's not a tiny difference between the control groups and the kids who are part of the Spark program. It's actually a pretty big difference. The Department of Education says that anything above 0.25 on that D up there basically means that it is more than a modest increase. so a 0.5 and a 0.57 are starting to tell us that those increases are significant. They mean something. Next slide.
We also worked with a lot of qualitative data. So we would take a small group of target students and do several performative tasks with them. This one we are looking at, we showed them a small clip of a show they will see called Seed Folks. And we asked them questions attempting to get their sense of empathy around the characters that they saw. Next slide, please. So here are the responses of one young woman who we spoke to recently. And I just want us to maybe quickly read through. What's really exciting is the depth and range of the emotional responses of this young person's interactions. She made connections to other shows she's seen at the New Victory. She makes personal connections from her own emotional experience, as well as other media and art forms that she's consumed in her life.
Next slide. So the other thing that we have learned is that the data doesn't lie. So our elementary school data that is coming in is very clear. It's all upward trends. It is telling us in a very clear manner, the Spark program in elementary schools makes a big difference for these young people and for the school culture. Our middle school data is telling us something much, much more complicated. And the great part about this is that that information coming back to us is completely representative of the experience that we are also having in middle school. So one of the things that I have been thrilled with is the middle school data being more complicated means that we are getting a ton of information back into the program about ways that we need to adjust the program, things that we need to try to, teaching artist training that we need to do more of. And that information we've never had before. We've never been able to say, something doesn't seem like it's working, but I don't really know. And this time, we're in the middle schools. It's a much more complicated and complex situation. Some students are responding incredibly well to the Spark program, and it looks like, oh, the control group is doing this, and then Spark 1 year and Spark 2 year, they've gone up. That is happening for some students. But other students, and you can find in this data, again, if you look at that, Denny might need to help me, but other students are basically not having that same experience. The range of responses to the Spark program across the middle school students is highly variable. So that's interesting for us to be able to take the information that's coming back from the research and have it impact the program. Next slide.
Yeah, so basically, this is Denny, basically the whiskers on each of those bars is showing how much variability there is in the scores for kids. Yep. That's the spread. Yeah.
Oh, and it's been really, one of the great things actually that we didn't anticipate about this is that the teaching artists this is information from one specific middle school, and the teaching artists who have been working there for 3 years, they are coming back feeling really, I don't know, they have complex emotional reactions to their time in that school. And actually for them, it was incredibly gratifying to be able to see that the research reflects back the experience that they're having. But it is good to note when we launched on this assuming, wouldn't it be great if the Spark program does all these things for all these kids in all these schools? And in elementary school, it looks like it does. But in middle school, it looks like that's a much more complex answer or set of challenges. And we're not going to be able to go back to funders and say 100% we were the silver bullet in this school. However, we are going to be able to go back to our own programs and say, look at all this information we now have to be able to make adjustments. Next slide. So here are some of the costs of doing research that is this big and this massive and this multi-year. And there were things like back to our programmatic parts. It's like we're spending a lot of money on this research. We're excited about the information that's coming out, but gosh, it's hard to say, well, would it be better to just double this program if we know it's working? Should all the money be going in that direction? And we also worry about, well, gee whiz, what do we do next? You know, if the next piece of research we do, does it have to be at this level? That feels really daunting to think about. Next slide. But these benefits have also been incredibly gratifying, especially to an organization that has, you know, committed to doing this. We have so much more information. We are so much better equipped to be able to learn from data, to be able to understand it. Our artists, teaching artists are now they have so much training in all of this. It's been a really huge jump for us in this organization to be able to do this kind of research and also look at what it's telling us. Next slide. Back to you, Denny.
Okay, next
Great.
slide, Sheena.
Denny, just really quickly, would you like to pause now, or there's a couple of questions that have come in. Do you want to wait till the end to circle back and do the reflection first?
Yeah, sure. Let's just take a minute here and just, Courtney and Lindsay and Ben have been terrific about explaining what's a large undertaking. And I don't want people to be daunted. So maybe take a minute here to reflect, even if you're not going to embark on this gigantic evaluation. Are there things that you could take out of it? For instance, they've been very candid about learning from places where the data didn't work. But just take a minute and think about, are there, even no matter what level or what kind of evaluation you're doing right now, what can you harvest from what Lindsay and Courtney and Ben have had to say? Okay, Heather? Heather?
Great. Yes. Can you hear me?
So
great. Well, I
questions.
just yeah, a couple of questions. One, just for the folks at New Vic, a couple of questions just to, I think you mentioned it in the beginning, but there was a lot of conversation of, you know, how do we get internally ready to take something on like this, and then how do we sustain it? So I'm wondering if you could go back and just remind us, you're several years into the process. What is the overall arc right now of this research study? How many years is it in total? When did you start? If you could just remind us of that.
Absolutely. So let's see here. 6 years ago, in 2012, so that might be 6 years ago.
I should say this out loud. I'm sorry. I'm like giving notes. So we received the original grant in 2012, and then found out that was to do the planning. And then we made a full proposal for the scope of the program and the research, and were informed literally the day after Labor Day 2013 and said, go. So then we launched from there.
Yeah, and something that's good to know, so in 2013, just before Labor Day, we were actively searching for a part-time, basically events assistant. And then we got told that we got this grant and we were going to be doing this research. And we basically pulled that job description, reposted with a full-time job description that became Ben, that was looking for someone who was, yes, going to be doing some of the events work, but also had a lot more skills to be basically focused on getting this research up and running. So then that was a year of the getting the IRB and the MOU, and we didn't even really talk about getting students to sign their permission slips and getting parents to sign those permission slips. And then about 2 years ago, we sort of settled into now our regular rhythm of research, which basically looks like a couple of big research days in the schools in the fall, a couple of big research days in the schools in the spring, and that's when we're doing those socio-emotional measurement booklets and some of those qualitative measurement tasks, and then working with the schools over the course of the year doing classroom observations and surveys whenever they come to a show. And so now we've sort of settled into a rhythm, and I will tell you, 5 years, 6 years in now, it no longer feels daunting. Now it's a system, and it's pretty doable.
And so just to build off of that question, and Denny, you might be able to chime in on this one too. From the point of, deciding that this is something you wanted to pursue and doing the initial planning of it, and then now being in the middle or quite a long ways into the research, there was a slide a ways back where you shared all of the various stakeholders that make this happen. So there's the senior staff, there are the outside consultants, the artist researchers, the young adults, the program manager. What advice would you have for those on the webinar today for getting your organization ready for research of this type, and then that continued professional development that might be needed along the way to onboard artist teachers to this type of research as well as young adults? I'm just wondering if you could maybe unpack that a little bit for us in terms of just capacity building.
So I'm going to let Ben take in a second the part about the ongoing capacity building for our teaching artists. But the piece of advice that I think Courtney and I would give anybody who was sort of, flirting with whether this was something that was going to be interesting for their organization is, one, go talk to other organizations who are doing this. We were so lucky in that we were able, as part of our planning grant, to go down and talk to Big Thought down in Dallas, who had already done several large-scale research. And we got a ton of advice from them, and very real-world things, like make sure that your senior staff is completely committed up front, but also make sure that you hire someone that this is in their job description, that their job description contains bullet points about doing the research, about the IRB, about liaising with schools, about doing all this. And I think that one of the things that the National Guild has been really great about is, if you are thinking about doing this, get connected to other people who are in the midst of or who have done this. Ben, what would you say about the ongoing professional development?
I think what's really special about our ensemble of teaching artists is they themselves are very reflective practitioners and are constantly striving and working towards improving their own practice. And I feel like the research piece of it was introduced as another tool that they could put in their educator or artist toolbox. And our teaching artists also had many meetings with Denny and had access to the minds who were constructing this and making them happen. So it wasn't as if the information was being trickled down through various sources, but the teaching artists were also very present in the beginning, and I believe, Courtney, they were present as the program was being developed. So there was a lot of buy-in, from the beginning.
We had trainings during the planning time to figure out what were some of the questions that we were wanting to ask in terms of building a research project. And then we also we already had a small group of teaching artists who were already looking at our programs and helping us to do some evaluation, that they ended up being the first round of teaching artists who helped us to launch the program, meaning they were the advisors and the teaching artists who were doing the professional development and the residencies within the first two Spark schools that we brought on board. Additionally, I would say that we meet biannually with our research partner as a large group to look at all of the program and the research together to make really informed choices. And part of that process is inviting executive staff and other senior staff like the marketing director, development, et cetera, to be able to come in and hear more about that along the process. So helping to not only have our responsibility to report back to our supervisors directly, but making sure that we are communicating organizationally as the process is going, and to build that buy-in, because we are at some point going to disseminate all of this and need to communicate that, and we're going to need a team to help us with that.
Great, thank you guys. Denny, I don't know if you, before we move on, want to reflect at all on your role as an outside evaluator and your continued involvement, if you have advice for folks on the call for working with an outside consultant.
Yeah, I would just say two things. One is just, I think having an outside source can be a very important point of leverage and insight. In the same way that Nicole talked about how belonging to the collective impact study gives CYD an outside point of view, an outside impetus for looking at your data, for discussing it, that kind of thing. So particularly as organizations move to more than internal and more descriptive evaluation, I think having that outside point of view can be extremely important. Nicole gives us an example of collective impact. Nuvik worked with an outside consultant. It could be on a smaller scale. It could be someone on your board who has worked in this way, who's a researcher, who has done work in a school district. But somebody who can say, wait, no, let's think about this. Let's think about what we can claim, what we can't claim, how we're going to write this up, how it'll show up on our website. So that's one point. The second point is if you're going to have an outside source like that, make sure it's a two-way street. What do I mean by that? So Nicole talked earlier about being the artist amongst boys and girls clubs or athletic leagues or chess programs, and her making sure that it was a two-way street. Not only did she get data delivered to her, but she could ask questions going in the opposite direction. If you're going to have an outside source, you want that source to be open, in dialogue with you, interested in answering the questions of an arts-driven organization. I will say that as an evaluator, I have learned a huge amount from working side by side with artists about how to craft tasks, how to engage kids in tasks, how to keep longitudinal measures refreshed and thoughtful. So yes, outside point of reference. Yes, a two-way street. So are there other questions, Heather or Ruth?
No, I know you wanted to circle back to the interim assignment, so let's go ahead and do that now.
Yeah, so we gave
advance.
Advances. Yeah. At the end of the second webinar 2 weeks ago, we gave you an interim assignment. It was after the first two webinars. Somebody asked, had there been one between the first two? No. it was just at the midpoint. So we wanted to make sure that if you took the time or had the time to ask some questions, that we make an effort to answer those questions now. We're going into our 4th webinar, so it's our chance to make sure that we try and address issues by the time we're drawing to a close. So if you'll type them into the chat box, it would be great. And while we're waiting to see what challenging questions appear in the chat box, I wonder if other presenters, Gladys, Nicole, your voices have been very important. Are there other things you want to make sure before we sign off that get into the conversation? Okay, Heather.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions on the interim assignment right now, but I'll just circle back to one last question that we didn't get to earlier, and that was just to revisit the question around ethics. So I guess in all of this research, and we're dealing with young people and control groups and data, this has been coming up on, I think, all of the webinars in terms of respecting young people's voices, the anonymity of the data in cases, and I just wondered if any of the presenters on today's webinar could share, what their insights to the ethics of this type of large-scale research, whether it's a control group or larger collective impact group, or the role of young people in this work.
This is Lindsay over at the NUVIC. There are parts of this that we definitely are still sort of thinking through. The socio-emotional measurement booklets that we have our kids do at the very beginning and at the end of each year, they're not tests in that they don't have a right answer, but they are tests in that they are sitting for a class period filling out bubbles. And we've had a lot of conversations both internally and with our teaching artists about how does it feel to be one more piece of a testing culture. What we've discussed internally is that, that doing that comes along with 15 highly interactive, on their feet residency sessions and 3 shows per year. And so we feel like the offset is probably worth it. And the other thing that we've talked about is that the value of the information that we're hoping to be able to share back out to the field, we're hoping is going to increase how much arts education the field will be able to provide, and that for us is offsetting some of the, the challenges we have with basically putting this smaller group of students into sort of a testing situation more often.
I'll just offer, this is Denny, another example of ethics. One of the tasks we used is a well-researched one called Mind in the Eyes, which asks young people to look at just a horizontal sliver of a face and identify the emotions. We quickly realized that while the kids we were working with were largely young people of color, the classic task only presented adult and white faces. So one of the steps that the NUVIC artists and staff alike stepped up to was to supplementing that with photographs of a much wider range of ages and peoples. So I think an ethics question is always, what are the measures in and of themselves communicating to young people about who is a person who has emotions?
Thanks, everyone. Denny, we're almost at the end of our time, and I know we have one more webinar coming up in the series. So I don't know if you want to just spend a minute and let people know what's coming before we sign off.
Sure. The fourth, and I'm getting to love these, final webinar is our next one on October 24th, same time, same station. And in that, we'll be trying to do several things. We'll have a last case study. It will look at Arts Corps, a creative youth organization in Seattle, Washington. It will be our opportunity to use that case to in a way, go back and revisit things from values to data collection and analysis. We will also talk about some of the nuts and bolts of doing externally validated research. So things like having to have conversations with families about the research, asking young people and families for permissions, working out data agreements with your school districts, thinking about the contract with teaching artists to be researchers and teaching artists. And then the third part of what we'll do is Gladys Hidalgo has been a very active part of this webinar series. So we will be working with Gladys to revisit the creative youth development principles, particularly with respect to evaluation, and from a young person and from an emerging young leader in the field, think about what those principles are that we should take forward. Because it is our last session, it would be fabulous if between now and then people would email questions so that we can try and weave in answers to those. So that's where we are, Heather, and we look forward to the last act.
Great. And just as noted, this recording and the resources that were mentioned and shared will be shared out with all of you. Just give us about a day. It takes us a little time to put everything together. And if you're not receiving those emails, please let me know so that we can make sure that you get all of the materials. Also, we'll be hoping to see all of you at the Guild Conference in San Francisco next month. All of the presenters, many of the presenters in this series will be on site in San Francisco, and we look forward to continuing the conversations with all of you there as well as part of the Creative Youth Development track at this year's conference. And as Denny said, please forward your continued questions and thoughts to us. It really does help us inform the next webinar. There's my email address and the websites of some of our partners here on the webinar. And I just want to give a huge shout out to all of our presenters today for sharing their expertise and insights, to Sheena and Ruth again for helping field questions and thoughts and keeping us going. And we really look forward to seeing many of you next Tuesday and to continuing the work. So thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.